Hey guys, tonight we're crawling under the embroidered bed covers of royal history, right into the absurd, the awkward and the downright humiliating ends that befell kings and queens who probably thought they were too fancy to die like the rest of us. But fate, as it turns out, doesn't care if you wear a crown. It's got a sense of humour, and sometimes that humour comes in the form of slipping on a chamber pot or choking on your 15th turkey leg. You're sitting now in a candlelit chamber, somewhere in an imaginary European palace, the air heavy with the scent of rose oil and questionable decisions. You're leaning against a velvet cushion, feeling just a bit too warm under your layers of courtly robes, when you hear it giggle. A real one. The kind that starts in the chest and bubbles up. And then it happens again, and again, and you turn toward the throne and see the king. He's laughing uncontrollably. And just like that, he's dead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments too. I love seeing where in the world you're nodding off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in ancient Greece, where laughter, it turns out, can be lethal. According to multiple accounts, some myth, some maybe true, there was a man named Chrysippus, a philosopher actually, not a king, but someone held in high enough regard to be remembered for thousands of years. And what was his great contribution to humanity? He allegedly died laughing at his own joke. The story goes that one day Chrysippus saw a donkey eating his figs, and instead of doing what most people would do, shoo it away, he found it so funny that he decided to enhance the humour by instructing his servant to give the donkey a cup of wine too. Then, watching the drunken donkey munching away, Chrysippus burst out laughing, and couldn't stop. He laughed and laughed until he quite literally died from it. Now, some historians think this is apocryphal. Others suggest it may be exaggerated. He might have had a stroke or aneurysm, and the laughter was just the final straw. Still, that's a pretty ridiculous way to go out. Death by donkey comedy. If that doesn't make it into your family's history scroll, I don't know what does. But royalty, surely monarchs were above such silly exits, right? Well, no! Fast forward a few centuries to King Martin of Aragon, who reigned in the early 1400s. This is where things get properly regal, and equally absurd. The story is set in 1410. King Martin was suffering from indigestion, a rather mundane ailment for a king, but hey, everybody poops, even the people with castles. Anyway, the court jester was summoned to cheer him up, and the jester, doing what jesters do, delivered a joke about a hunting deer that escaped with its life by hiding in a tree. Not exactly side-splitting comedy by modern standards, but apparently it landed. Martin laughed. Hard. So hard, in fact, that he doubled over with laughter, and then keeled over. Dead. Right there in the royal bedchamber, his belly full of roast meats and gas, his ears still echoing with the words of a really average joke. Historians aren't 100% sure if the laughter is what killed him, or if the indigestion played a bigger part, but the tale of the jester's joke became part of the folklore surrounding Martin's end. A king dying from laughter? It doesn't get much more embarrassingly human than that. Now, some scholars suggest there might have been more to it. Martin's health was already in decline. He had been sickly, possibly with the plague, or something less medievally dramatic like advanced heart disease. Others argue it was actually a power struggle behind the scenes that led to a cover-up of a more political demise. But the version with the jester? That's the one people remember. Why? Because it's hilarious. And tragic. But mostly hilarious. There's something about laughter that feels like the ultimate act of rebellion against death, until death joins the punchline. Now imagine being the royal physician in that moment. You rush into the room, expecting a dire emergency, and you find your monarch red-faced, doubled over, guffawing like a fool. He's what? Laughing? At the deer joke? And then, just as you start to say, he'll be fine, he drops. Right there, the court jester freezes. You freeze. The whole room is silent except for the last echo of that laugh fading into eternity. You try mouth to mouth. You try praying. You even try offering him more fig wine like Chrysippus. Nothing works, and you realise you're about to write into the royal death record that your king, your noble, dignified, exalted ruler, died because he couldn't handle a pun. It's one thing to fall on the battlefield, another to be poisoned by a political rival, but to laugh yourself to death, that's the kind of thing your descendants try to scrub from the scrolls. Except it's too funny not to remember. The human body, for all its majesty, is surprisingly bad at multitasking. Prolonged laughter can actually cause a drop in oxygen intake, irregular heartbeat, and even a rare condition called gelastic syncope, where extreme laughter leads to fainting. So yeah, it's possible. If the king had a weak heart or some gastrointestinal distress brewing, the laughter might have been the thing that pushed him over the edge. But still, the deer in a tree. That's the joke that sealed his fate. And it makes you wonder, was the jester rewarded or punished? We don't know, but I like to imagine he was knighted. Sir Laugh-A-Lot, forever remembered as the man whose commentary act became royal execution. Let's pull back for a moment and look at the broader picture. Laughter has always had a strange place in history. In some cultures, it was sacred, seen as a release of divine energy. In others, it was considered vulgar, something only peasants did in taverns over spilled ale. For kings and queens, keeping a straight face was often part of the job. After all, nobody wants to follow a ruler who collapses into giggles every time someone trips over a carpet. But maybe there's something poetic in the fact that even monarchs can be undone by a simple chuckle. It reminds us that behind the gold-threaded robes, the scepters, the titles like Defender of the Faith or High Protector of the Realm, they were just people, with ticklish ribs, weak stomachs, and a bad sense of humour. So if you ever feel embarrassed about laughing at something silly until your belly hurts, just remember, you're in royal company. And hopefully, unlike poor King Martin, you live to laugh another day. You're still lounging in the shadows of royal chambers, the scent of lavender oil and powdered wigs floating faintly through the velvet-draped corridors. Your feet are tucked into borrowed slippers, the kind lined with rabbit fur and embroidered with a crest. No, not the modern kind with paparazzi and headlines. The kind that involves a castle, a staircase, an excessively tight corset, and the cruel weight of expectations. Tonight's tale is stitched together from the fine fabric of royal embarrassment. Literally. Let's set the scene. You're standing at the base of a grand marble staircase, polished smooth by the footsteps of countless nobles pretending not to judge each other. At the top stands Queen Caroline of Ansban, wife of King George II of Great Britain. It's the 1700s, which means we're knee-deep in powdered faces, towering wigs, and enough satin to wrap the moon twice. And it's about to get tragic. Caroline was no fool. She was sharp, politically savvy, and pretty well liked. But one thing she couldn't outmaneuver: fashion. Especially the kind designed by people who'd never personally worn a corset, but insisted that 17-inch waists were the absolute height of beauty. One evening, after a banquet filled with meat pies and awkward flute music, the Queen began to feel unwell. Now, according to the records, she had suffered from umbilical hernias after childbirth, which, back in those lovely pre-modern medicine days, were treated mostly by pretending they didn't exist. Corsets were cinched tight, layers were added, and the pressure grew. Fast forward to 1737, Caroline collapses, not in a sweeping cinematic faint where a lady flutters her eyelashes and is caught mid-fall by a handsome duke. No, this was a slow, agonizing descent into pain that doctors couldn't explain or treat properly. They cut into her, repeatedly, without anesthesia, of course. Here's the part where history gets fuzzy and slightly horrifying. Some accounts say her bowels ruptured due to a strangulated hernia caused by her tightly bound corset. Others say it was a combination of repeated pregnancies and medical negligence. What's agreed upon is that her condition worsened, her abdomen swelled monstrously, and for over a week, Caroline endured some of the worst suffering imaginable. And throughout all of it, she reportedly maintained her composure. At one point, when the surgeon hesitated during another grim incision, she is said to have muttered, "I know you have a great knife, but have a care how you strike it." Yes, even in the face of mortal agony and failing royal dignity, she was still giving one-liners. King George was devastated. Historians note he wept openly at her bedside. But in a particularly awkward exchange, one of those cringe moments that only real life could deliver, he apparently told her, "You know, Caroline, I loved you once." To which she replied, "I believe it." Oof. That's not just a mic drop. That's a golden sector shattering on a marble floor. Now, while Caroline's death may not have been a straight-up wardrobe malfunction in the modern sense, the role her royal clothing played can't be ignored. Those corsets, tightened daily, stuffed with whalebone, reinforced with steel, laced up tighter than a conspiracy in the royal court, didn't just sculpt a fashionable figure. They crushed organs. They displaced ribs. They literally squeezed the life out of women, all in the name of elegance. Modern scholars still argue about whether the corset caused the rupture directly or just made things worse. Some say her death was inevitable from infection. Others believe that, had she not been bound so tightly, she might have survived. But one thing's certain, her wardrobe did her no favours. And just to twist the dagger of embarrassment, it's said that her belly was left open and draining for several days before her death. Doctors didn't know what else to do. Royal dignity, out the window. Modesty, gutted along with everything else. There's something darkly ironic about a queen, draped in pearls and privilege, lying helpless while physicians poked around blindly inside her, looking for answers they never found. It makes you want to loosen your waistband, doesn't it? Let's shift continents briefly and peek in on another royal who fell victim to fashion. This time, in the 16th century, we find ourselves tiptoeing through the imperial palaces of Ming Dynasty China. The Empress Dowager Cixi, while not killed by her robes, reportedly wore garments so heavy with jade, silk and gold thread that she couldn't walk without assistance. And while she survived her fashion choices, several of her ladies-in-waiting weren't so lucky, collapsing from heat stroke or tripping over the miles of fabric they were required to wear. Because nothing says grace like dying in a puddle of your own sweat while holding up someone else's train. Back to our European scene. Caroline wasn't the only royal squeezed to death by society's expectations. The French court was infamous for it. Some women literally fainted during public appearances, not from shock, but from lack of oxygen. Layers of brocade, stays, undergarments and hoop skirts created a walking coffin of beauty standards. Some royals even had fainting couches installed in nearly every room, because passing out was just part of the aesthetic. And it wasn't just women. Men too wore tightly fitted clothing that left little room to breathe. Those doublets weren't designed for comfort. They were status symbols, stitched with stiffening agents and meant to convey control and discipline. Meanwhile, everyone was one sneeze away from a hernia. Of course, as with most royal absurdities, it wasn't all about fashion. It was about appearances, about projecting an image of divine right, of control, of perfection. Royals were supposed to be more than human. They were walking symbols of order, of God's will. But when a corset cuts off your circulation and sends your intestines into rebellion, it's hard to maintain that illusion. Some historians believe Queen Caroline's death was a turning point in the way British royals approached health and medical treatment. Others say it changed nothing. She was mourned deeply, yes, but her death was followed by more pomp, more protocol, more silken death traps. And so the fashion continued, and so did the quiet, breathless suffering of generations to come. In a way, Caroline's passing wasn't just an embarrassing royal death. It was a symbol of how absurd and deadly the expectations placed on monarchs could be. Not just the political pressure, but the literal, physical pressure of corsets, image, and always needing to look graceful. So the next time you find yourself uncomfortable in a tight pair of jeans or sweating under too many layers, just remember, at least no one's forcing you into a rib-cracking bodice for a 12-hour banquet. And if you are, maybe rethink your invitation list. You're still curled up under the heavy velvet of royal absurdity, the kind that smells faintly of mildew, melted wax, and too much responsibility. The torches on the palace walls flicker with low, moody light. Somewhere in the distance a bell tolls, ominous like it's counting down to something dreadful. You move quietly through a cold, dark stone corridor, past portraits of monarchs with far too many buttons on their coat. And then the stench hits you. It's the unmistakable, stomach-turning scent of rot, of old meat, of, well, something that used to be someone. Tonight, you're going to witness something very few people in history ever talk about in polite company. A royal body that quite literally exploded. Yes, exploded. We're in the 12th century now, and the unfortunate subject of tonight's tale is King William I of England, better known as William the Conqueror. You remember him. Battle of Hastings, 1066, Norman invasion, pointy helmet. He's a big deal. But his death? Oh, it's a whole different kind of legacy. William spent most of his life as a formidable force, conquering lands, enforcing laws, and solidifying a reign that terrified. And in 1087, during one of those campaigns in northern France, William's horse stumbled while he was riding through the burning ruins of Mantes. The king was violently thrown forward directly onto the pommel of his saddle. Now, this was no soft landing. Medieval saddles weren't built for comfort. They were high, hard, and meant to keep a knight locked in during battle. So when William's sizable belly slammed into the unforgiving saddle, it caused what historians delicately call severe internal injuries. He didn't die right away. Oh no, he lingered. For weeks. Laid up in bed, groaning through the pain, William slowly rotted from the inside out. Infection set in. His abdomen began to swell. His attendants, probably unsure whether to call a doctor or an exorcist, did what they could, which, in 1087, wasn't much beyond prayer and applying disgusting ointments made of herbs and, let's be honest, probably frog slime. And then, finally, he died. But that's not the embarrassing part. It's what happened after he died that earns William his place in this royal hall of shame. As was tradition, William's body was to be embalmed and interred with great ceremony. He was, after all, a king. But there was a delay, a long one. Political squabbles, weather, and the sheer logistics of holding a bloated royal corpse across hundreds of miles meant that his funeral was postponed. Meanwhile, his body... So, on the day of the funeral, they tried to squeeze him into a stone sarcophagus that was, let's say, less than generously sized, and as the monks lowered him into place, forcing the body into a too tight space under the gaze of silent, sweating nobles, his abdomen burst. Imagine the echo of that sound in a stone cathedral. The wet pop, the rush of gases, the splatter, monks recoiling, nobles trying not to gag into their sleeves, the king, once conqueror of England, reduced to a grotesque explosion in front of his entire court. That's not just undignified. That's cinematic tragedy mixed with slapstick horror. Some chroniclers of the time were surprisingly candid about it. One monk wrote that a noxious stench filled the church. Another described the entire service being disrupted by the event, with mourners fleeing the scene. And really, can you blame them? Modern forensic scientists actually support the plausibility of this story. When a body begins to decompose, internal gases build up, especially if the person died from internal injuries or infection. Add in the summer heat, poor embalming, and a tight coffin, and boom. It's not just possible. It's almost expected. Of course, some historians debate whether the story was exaggerated by enemies of William who wanted to tarnish his memory. After all, he wasn't universally beloved. Conquering a country tends to ruffle feathers. Some say the details of the explosion were embellished to symbolically mock the man who once burst into England and now burst out of his own tomb. Still, the tale endured, and whether or not it happened exactly as described, it's been repeated in historical texts for nearly 1,000 years. And let's be honest, if it didn't happen, someone went to an awful lot of trouble to invent it. Either way, William's not escaping this list. Now, let's zoom out a bit. William's not the only royal who had a complicated post-mortem experience. Take Pope Formosus, not technically a king, but definitely a man of power. He was exhumed after death, dressed in papal robes propped up on a throne, and put on trial by his successor. Imagine being so hated that they dig you up just to yell at your corpse. William may have exploded, but at least no... Back to our medieval kings. There's something grimly poetic about William's death. He spent his life expanding his territory, his army, his waistline, and in death his body couldn't contain the pressure. It's almost a cautionary tale. Conquer all you want, but make sure your coffin fits. And then there's the issue of legacy. Despite his explosive ending, William the Conqueror remains one of the most significant figures in English history. His Domesday Book, the massive survey of England's lands and wealth, is still studied today. His victory at Hastings changed the political and cultural landscape of Europe. He ruled with strength, cunning, and brutal efficiency. But all of that kind of takes a back seat when people remember the POC. And isn't that just the way history works? You can write laws, build empires, fund cathedrals, but if you detonate at your own funeral, that's what goes in the group chat of history. So the next time you feel bloated after dinner, just remind yourself, at least you're not being wedged into a marble tomb by nervous monks while nobles hold their noses and try not to throw up. That's the real takeaway. Also, always measure the coffin before you commission the marble. The castle is quiet now, the kind of quiet that creaks, a hush that sticks to the old stone walls and drips down the mossy corners like a forgotten secret. You're walking slower now, your slippers dragging just slightly across the cold flagstones. The torch in your hand flickers every time you pass a narrow, drafty slit of a window. And then, there it is. The smell again. You brace yourself for another explosive king, but this time, it's not rot. It's something worse. It smells like sewage. Tonight, you descend, quite literally, into one of the most embarrassingly bizarre royal deaths in all of history. So buckle your belt and keep your feet steady. We're going down into the loo. Our unlucky monarch is King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, or perhaps King Edmund Ironside of England. Wait, or was it King George II? Yes, this particular humiliation has been rumoured about many kings, which is part of what makes it so wonderful. Death by toilet has been passed around royalty like a very unflattering hand-me-down. But tonight, we're sticking with the best documented, most tragically amusing case. King George VI of Great Britain. George II was, well, not the most thrilling of monarchs. He reigned during the 18th century, a time of powdered wigs, chamber music, and painfully uncomfortable court etiquette. He was a stickler for protocol, a bit cold emotionally, and he wasn't exactly known for his inspiring speeches. But none of that would matter in the end, because George II's final moment came not in battle, not in court, but in the privy. It was October 1760. George was 76 years old, a respectable age for the time, especially for a man who'd survived not only wars and revolts, but decades of political backstabbing in powdered shoes. He was in relatively good health, or so people thought, until that fateful morning when he excused himself from his chambers and toddled off to use the royal commode. Now, let's pause for a moment to consider what a royal toilet looked like in the 1700s. You might be imagining something elegant, jewel-encrusted, perhaps embroidered with lions and unicorns. Nope, it was basically a glorified chair with a chamber pot underneath. Maybe some silk upholstery, sure, but at the end of the day, still a bucket for your business. So George sat down to do what kings do, in private. Except this time, something went terribly wrong. Eyewitness accounts suggest he experienced a sudden heart attack, or aortic aneurysm, while seated. 1 minute he was reigning, the next, he was dethroned. He collapsed, presumably midway, and fell to the floor. When attendants found him shortly after, he was already gone, pants reportedly around his ankles. Dignity? Not included. Medical reports of the time stated it was a rupture of the right ventricle of the heart, which, let's be honest, sounds much better than died on the toilet. Now, scholars still argue about what exactly happened. Some insist it was a stroke, others say an aneurysm. There's even a fringe theory that the strain of royal bowel movement triggered the whole thing. That theory, while mostly tongue-in-cheek today, actually aligns with modern medical knowledge, a Valsalva maneuver. A splaining during a bowel movement can increase internal pressure and cause cardiovascular events, especially in older individuals. So yes, it's plausible. He might have pooped himself to death. And there's something deeply, cosmically humbling about that. Imagine a man who ruled an empire, who oversaw armies, colonies, and parliament, reduced to a footnote in the annals of mortifying mortality, his final moment spent alone, in a tiny wooden room, with his bare bottom cold against polished wood. If that doesn't make you feel better about your own bad days, I don't know what will. George II isn't even the only one. Let's rewind to the 9th century and talk about King Edmund Ironside, the Saxon monarch with a name so cool it sounds like a Dungeons and Dragons character. His death was rumoured to be even more absurd. One version of the story goes like this. Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet, stabbed from beneath by a traitor hiding in the latrine pit. I'll just give you a moment to let that image settle in. Yes, murder. From below. Historians debate the truth of this claim. Some say it's slander, a smear campaign by Norman chroniclers eager to make Saxons look foolish. Others suggest it was a poetic exaggeration of a real betrayal. But the imagery, too vivid to forget. You can picture it, can't you? A shadowy figure crouching for hours in sewage, waiting, listening, the sound of footsteps overhead, the creak of the lid, the royal behind, descending from above like a divine target. And then, you could write a Shakespeare play based on that scene alone. Of course, not all toilet royal deaths were physical. Some were reputational. Take Louis XVI of France. No, he didn't die on the toilet, but he was mocked for installing hundreds of luxury privies in Versailles, while his people starved. The king builds golden toilets, they said, while we have nothing to eat. And while that didn't kill him directly, the guillotine certainly did, proof that bathroom choices can in fact come back to bite you. But George II remains the king most famously associated with a lavatorial death. For centuries, comedians, satirists, and casual historians have pointed to his demise as the ultimate royal humbling. Even in death, he had no last words. No heroic monologue, no dramatic farewell, just a quick, undignified collapse into silence. It reminds us that history isn't all grand parades and noble battles. Sometimes it's just a tired old man, doing what everyone does, and not making it out the other side. But hey, at least it was quick. And unlike poor William the Conqueror, he didn't explode. Small victories. The wind picks up outside the castle walls as you drift deeper into the hallways of royal embarrassment. It whistles softly through the arrow slits, pushing dust across long abandoned rugs. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy wooden door creaks on its hinges, and you imagine some unlucky servant trying to explain yet another absurd royal accident to a court full of powdered nobles. But tonight's tale is quieter, stranger, almost absurd in its simplicity. Tonight, you witness the downfall of a mighty emperor, not by sword, nor poison, nor some clumsy tumble down a spiral staircase, but by the most mundane, pathetic villain of all. A nosebleed. Let that sink in. You've likely had a nosebleed before, maybe from dry air or allergies, or sticking your finger up there during a particularly boring church sermon. But did it ever rewrite the future of an entire empire? Because that might have been what happened in the strange and still debated death of Attila the Hun. Yes, that Attila, the so-called Scourge of God, the horse-riding warlord who burned cities, trampled armies, and gave nightmares to Roman emperors. The man who could terrify whole civilizations with nothing but his name. You'd expect a man like that to go out in flames, on the battlefield, covered in blood, possibly while laughing and holding someone else's severed crown. Instead, he died of a nosebleed, on his wedding night. Let's back up. It was the year 453 AD. Attila was in his prime. His empire stretched from the Black Sea to the plains of Central Europe, and he had just married, again, this time to a young Gothic princess named Ildiko, and by all accounts he was celebrating the way many victorious kings do, with a giant banquet, too much wine, and, well, you can guess the rest. The feast was lavish, the wine flowed freely, everyone was celebrating, and Attila, that terrifying conqueror, eventually staggered off to his chamber with his new bride. All seemed well. Until morning. When attendants entered his room, they found the bride weeping, the bed soaked in blood, and Attila very much dead. Not stabbed, not strangled, no signs of battle. According to one contemporary chronicler, the Roman historian Priscus, Attila had suffered a violent nosebleed in his sleep. Because of his heavy drinking and possibly a congenital issue, the bleeding had gone unnoticed. He had simply drowned in his own blood while unconscious. A slow, suffocating death from the inside out. Cue the record scratch. Seriously? That's how the fiercest warlord of the ancient world died? Not even a dramatic sword fight? Scholars have never stopped arguing about it. Some insist that Ildico was part of an assassination plot, perhaps sent by Eastern Roman authorities. Others believe he had an aneurysm or suffered from esophageal viruses. Swollen veins in the throat that can rupture and cause rapid internal bleeding, often triggered by excessive alcohol consumption. It's also possible that a heavy nosebleed in a reclining position might indeed have choked him to death, especially if no one dared check on him during his wedding night. And that's part of the charm of the tale. No one wanted to interrupt Attila's celebration. The man had just conquered half the continent. You think a servant's going to knock on his door and ask if everything's okay? Not likely. So they let him be. And by morning, well, the empire would never be the same. His death threw the Hunnic Empire into chaos. His sons squabbled over power. His generals fell into infighting. The territories he held began to splinter, and within a few short decades, the fearsome Huns had all but vanished from the map. All because of a nosebleed. You almost feel bad for the man. Almost. But let's not forget, this was Attila. He razed cities. He took countless lives. He showed mercy to no one. And yet, for all that carnage, the thing that finally brought him down wasn't an enemy blade. It was his own blood, turning on him like a treacherous tide. Some historians argue that the nosebleed story was Roman propaganda, a way to diminish Attila's legend and reduce him to a punchline. After all, nothing deflates a boogeyman faster than saying, he bled out in bed while drunk. It's the ancient equivalent of slipping on a banana peel. But even if it was propaganda, it stuck, because it's just plausible enough to make sense, and just ridiculous enough to be memorable. And it's not the only case of blood-doing in a royal figure. Let's jump ahead a few centuries to the tragic case of Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad, which, honestly, is a pretty bold nickname. It's like calling yourself Steve the Unbearable and expecting people to forget it. Charles ruled during the 14th century and had a reputation for cruelty, manipulation, and generally being the kind of guy who made everyone at the dinner party feel nervous. By the time he was an older man, he was suffering from illness, likely due to gout or some degenerative disease. Physicians at the time believed in the therapeutic powers of wrapping the body in soaked linen bandages soaked with brandy. You already see where this is going. One night, Charles's attendant prepared the linen as usual, but instead of stitching or securing the bandages carefully, they used a candle to seal the cloths. Yes, they lit the king on fire. The brandy-soaked linens caught instantly. The flames raced up his body. Charles the Bad burned alive in his own bed, wrapped like a royal torch. No battlefield, no assassin, just flammable pajamas and a poor understanding of fire safety. Some say he lived for hours afterwards, screaming in agony. Others say it was over quickly. Either way, it wasn't elegant. It wasn't regal. It was the kind of death that makes you double-check your bedtime routine. But perhaps most poetic is how death tends to humiliate even the mighty. Whether it's a nosebleed, a drunken fall, or a fire caused by brandy bandages, it all brings kings down to the same level as everyone else. Naked, flailing, and probably very confused. Even Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military minds in human history, may have died from, wait for it, a mosquito bite. Some believe he contracted West Nile virus or malaria, fell into a coma, and was buried while still alive, since the ancient Greeks declared death by lack of breath, not by pulse. His body reportedly didn't decompose for days, which fueled the rumour. So yeah, possibly buried alive, possibly just... You don't get that kind of plot twist in textbooks. So next time you feel a nosebleed coming on, don't panic, but maybe lie on your side, just to be safe. And if someone offers to swaddle you in brandy before bed, politely decline. Because history shows us that death doesn't care if you're wearing a crown. It doesn't care how many titles you have, how many lands you own, or how big your army is. Sometimes, all it takes is one tiny blood vessel to change the course of an empire. The castle is darker now, quieter. You can almost hear your own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls as you pad softly into another part of history that smells faintly of roast goose, overcooked cabbage, and the kind of desperation that only comes from one too many trips to the royal buffet. Yes, tonight you're heading to the dining hall. Not for a feast, though. You're here to witness one of the most tragically gluttonous ends to a royal life ever recorded. A prince who quite literally ate himself to death. Let's set the table. Tonight's main course is Adolf Frederick, King of Sweden from 1751 to 1771. His death was one of the most famously ridiculous fatalities in all of European monarchy. He ruled during a time of parliamentary dominance, meaning he didn't wield much power politically, but he did have full command of one very important domain, his dinner plate. By all accounts, Adolf Frederick loved food. This man wasn't nibbling on grapes and sipping lukewarm wine in ivory towers. He was a king who lived to eat, a true food enthusiast, a monarch with the stomach of a champion and the restraint of a raccoon in a candy shop. But on February 12, 1771, during the festival of Shrove Tuesday, King Adolf outdid himself. Let's go through his menu. He began the meal with lobster, then caviar. After that, a generous portion of sauerkraut, then some smoked herring, and plenty of champagne. You might be thinking, okay, that's heavy but not fatal. Ah, but we're not done. After all that came 14 servings of semla. Semla is a traditional Swedish pastry, a sweet cardamom bun, filled with almond paste and whipped cream, served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It's heavy, it's rich, it's decadent, and it is not something you should eat 14 of, not even on your birthday, certainly not when you... And yet, King Adolf powered through. Some say he was trying to show off. Others say he simply couldn't help himself. Either way, shortly after his final bung, the king complained of a stomachache. Within hours, he collapsed and died. Just like that. His official cause of death? Overconsumption. That's right. The king was defeated not by an army or an assassin or even a royal scandal, but by dessert. His own kitchen, his own spoon, and 14 bowls of sweet milky doom. Some modern historians speculate he may have had a heart attack or a stroke, both of which can be triggered by sudden overindulgence, especially in someone already vulnerable due to age or health. But most agree that the sheer amount of food he consumed that evening was enough to strain anybody past its breaking point. Swedish schoolchildren today still joke that he was the king who ate himself to death, which is probably not the legacy he was hoping for. And yet, it's kind of iconic. Now, King Adolf wasn't the only royal to meet his end through excessive eating. Let's wander over to Zhao of Yan, a Chinese ruler from the Warring States period, who once ate so many dumplings in one sitting that he reportedly lost consciousness and died. His court physicians were baffled, his ministers were furious, his chef? Probably unemployed. Meanwhile, Henry I of England, a son of William the Conqueror, yes, the exploding one, also succumbed to gluttony. His fatal flaw? Lampreys. Lampreys are eel-like fish that look like something out of a medieval horror movie. They're slim serpentine, and somehow still considered a delicacy by royals with no sense of self-preservation. Henry loved them. Loved them so much, in fact, that his doctors begged him to stop. They told him the rich, oily flesh was too much for his stomach. So naturally, he ignored them. One massive lamprey binge later, Henry was struck with a sudden fever and died shortly after. His death was so preventable, it's almost impressive. His son probably looked at the medical report and thought, seriously? Fish? And then there's Louis III of France, who allegedly died while eating at a banquet where he choked after laughing too hard mid-bite. The moral here? Never combine humour and heavy mouthfuls, especially not if you're trying to look regal while snacking on pheasant. Let's not forget that food was more than just nourishment for these people. For royalty, it was a performance, a display of power, wealth, control. Imagine dozens of servants standing silently by as a king gorges himself. No one dares whisper, no one dares stop him. They just refill the wine and bring the next course. and the next. It wasn't just about appetite, it was about indulgence without consequence, until the consequences hit. In Adolf Frederick's case, it was a full-on digestive revolt. One can only imagine the sounds echoing through the palace halls as the king's stomach finally cried mutiny. The bloating, the gas, the undignified groaning of a man who'd conquered the buffet table but lost the war of digestion. Some accounts even say that, in his final moments, he tried to reach for one more semla, as if to say, "If I'm going out sweet." Poetic, but also very sad. Interestingly, semla became even more popular in Sweden after Adolf's death, as if the nation looked at his end and thought, what a way to go. Today, you can still buy them in bakeries each Shrove Tuesday. Some even call them King Adolf's Revenge. And yes, it's customary to stop at 1, 2 if you're feeling brave, 14 if you're trying to make headlines. So, what does this tell us? Well, for one thing, royalty really needs better portion control. But more importantly, it reminds us that excess, even of something as seemingly innocent as dessert, can topple empires. Or at least, empers. You spend your whole life ruling with gold scepters, signing treaties, riding in silk-draped carriages, and then you're taken out by a pastry. Somewhere a court jester is still laughing. Even now, centuries later, the image of a bloated king groaning in a velvet chair, surrounded by half-eaten cream buns and stunned servants, is both hilarious and a little haunting. Because deep down, we know this could happen to any of us. We've all had that one meal, that one extra slice, that I shouldn't but I will moment. The only difference is, we're not wearing crowns when we do it. So here's to King Adolf, the man who taught us that sometimes too much of a good thing really is, well, too much. The royal banquet is over now, the dishes cleared away by exhausted footmen whose arms ache from lifting gold-plated everything. You shuffle slowly through a hallway lined with suits of armour, the clink of your slippers echoing with each step. Past towering portraits of grim-faced monarchs, past hollow-eyed statues pretending not to judge. The feasting hall may be silent, but your journey through absurd royal demises is far from done. Tonight we unwrap one of the strangest royal exits ever recorded. Because in this tale, it's the gifts that kill. Yes, you're about to witness the slow, suffocating downfall of a king who was, quite literally, crushed by generosity. The monarch in question, King James II of Scotland, who reigned in the mid-15th century. But before we unravel his peculiar fate, we need to widen our lens, because this wasn't a one-off. Throughout history, several royals have been victims of their own opulence, buried under the weight of gold, ceremony and symbolic presence they really didn't need. Let's start with a warm-up. Travel back with me to Bhumibol Adulyadej, the late king of Thailand. During his long reign, Bhumibol received thousands of gifts, so many in fact that entire wings of his palace were turned into storage museums. Most were harmless: elephant statues, portraits, silk robes. But there was one moment that made headlines. During a royal tour, he was nearly injured when a massive gold-framed painting tipped and fell toward him during a ceremony. Panic erupted. Guards rushed in. No one was harmed, thankfully, but the symbolism was hard to ignore. Even admiration has weight, and sometimes it teeters. That's just foreshadowing. Because now we return to the 1400s. The court of King James II is a swirl of pageantry. His rule was tempestuous, marked by feuds, power struggles, and one of the most aggressive expansions of monarchical control in Scottish history. But he also had a flair for drama, and a fondness for extravagance. The particular event in question happened during a diplomatic meeting. A group of noblemen, intent on currying favour, presented the king with an array of tributes: armour, jewels, weapons. And then came the piece de résistance, a massive, elaborately constructed cannon. This was no ordinary gift. It was a show of craftsmanship, innovation, and loyalty all rolled into one terrifying weapon. It was large, ornate, embellished with silver and gold leaf. The kind of thing that says, "I care about you, and I want you to blow up your enemies in style." James was thrilled. He immediately insisted on a demonstration. The cannon was rolled out to the field, crowds gathered, the air was thick with anticipation, and the king stood proudly nearby, ready to bask in the glory of this mechanized marvel. And then, boom. Not the kind you want. The cannon exploded, spectacularly. Instead of firing a projectile outward, it burst open from within. Shards of hot metal tore through the air. The king, standing far too close, was struck and killed instantly. Some say it blew off his thigh. Others say his chest was pierced. Eyewitnesses were so shocked they didn't even move at first, convinced the king had just disappeared in the smoke. This, historians agree, was not the PR moment anyone had planned. And it all started with a gift. To this day, it's debated whether the cannon was faulty or sabotaged. Some scholars suggest it was simply overloaded with powder in an attempt to impress. Others whisper of treachery, someone slipping extra powder into the chamber to accidentally solve a political problem. The truth remains unclear. But the symbolism, that's crystal. King, literally destroyed by a present that was meant to display loyalty and innovation. It's the royal version of getting a toaster that electrocutes you on Christmas morning. Tragic. But if you step back far enough, kind of ridiculous. And James II wasn't the only one to be overwhelmed by royal tribute. Let's glide east now, into the imperial courts of China. There we find Emperor Jing of Han, a ruler who believed strongly in omens, dreams, and the power of symbolism. During one lunar festival, his subjects showered him with jade statues and silk dragons. Dozens of carts were required to carry them all, but amidst the sea of well-meaning gifts was one crucial flaw. No one had considered the weight limits of the palace's wooden mezzanine. You see where this is going. During the presentation ceremony, as drums thundered and servants bowed, the floor beneath the tribute collapsed. Carts, statues, and boxes plummeted. Jing, who had insisted on watching from above to honor the gods, was thrown backward. He survived, but was seriously injured and bedridden for weeks. Whispers circled the court. Was it a message from the heavens? Was it sabotage? Or just bad math? Either way, the lesson was clear. Sometimes admiration comes with a splintered floor and a crushed spine. Now, let's return to Europe for one more peculiar tale. This one involving Philip the Fair, King of France in the early 1300 SS. Philip was a collector of laws, of taxes, and, oddly enough, of livestock. During a particularly indulgent celebration of his coronation anniversary, nobles across France sent exotic animals to his palace. Peacocks, leopards, giant dogs, and even a particularly large camel. The idea was to outdo each other in opulence. But these were not well-trained pets. They were wild, irritated, and, frankly, not thrilled about palace life. According to one source, while inspecting his collection, Philip was trampled by two enormous oxen that had been gifted by a noble in Toulouse. The king survived the initial incident, but suffered internal injuries that worsened over the next few weeks. He eventually succumbed, though the official cause of death remained vague. The court simply noted, he declined. Which is medieval, for he got sat on by two cows and never quite bounced back. Even in royal circles, trampled by gifts doesn't look good on a tombstone. What connects these stories isn't just the absurdity. It's the reminder that symbolism can have real-world consequences. Kings wanted to be loved, adored, honoured, but the people doing the honouring, often more interested in outdoing each other than protecting their sovereign. Imagine being a servant in those courts, watching your king accept a £500 gold-plated chair, then struggling to carry it to the throne room without snapping a vertebrae. You'd probably mutter, "Oh sure, let's all just get flattened for glory." And sometimes they were. Which brings us back to the present. The next time you're stressed about giving the perfect gift, just remember, at least you're not dragging a camel up a staircase or praying a decorative cannon doesn't explode in your boss's face. History teaches many lessons, but this one's clear. Sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to impressing people with sharp metal objects and livestock. So if you ever meet a king, maybe just stick with a nice fruit basket. The corridors are getting narrower now, the stone walls pressing inward as if they too are holding their breath. You feel a chill, not from ghosts or spirits, but from anticipation. Because we're leaving behind the grand halls and thundering cannons for something a little more intimate. Tonight, you tiptoe into a royal boudoir. Silk curtains flutter slightly in the breeze from a cracked window. Perfume lingers in the air, roses, sandalwood, and something more metallic. Something that doesn't belong. Because tonight, your witness is not a great warrior or a boisterous king. She is delicate, poised, and utterly tragic. This is the story of a woman known more for how she looked than how she ruled. An empress whose end came not with rebellion or betrayal, but with glass and Yes, you're about to meet Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known lovingly and famously as Sisi, and discover how one of history's most beautiful women met an end so strange it was almost invisible. First, let's paint the scene. Elizabeth was the wife of Emperor Franz Joseph and lived during the 19th century. She was, in every sense, the royal influencer of her age. Sisi was obsessed with beauty, slimness, and perfection. She maintained a waistline that hovered around 19 inches, an achievement she maintained with corsets tighter than a miser's purse, daily exercise, and a diet that would... She washed her famously long hair in eggs and brandy. She avoided public appearances if she wasn't feeling absolutely flawless, and she loathed the rigid structure of court life. More poet than politician, she became a wanderer, constantly travelling across Europe, avoiding the stifling Viennese court and the burden of being a symbol rather than a person. Which brings us to her final journey. It was 1898. Sisi was travelling incognito in Geneva, Switzerland. No parade, no entourage, just a companion and the pseudonym Countess of Hohenheim. She stayed in modest hotels, walked the lakeside paths, and tried to live. But history had other plans. On the afternoon of September 10th, she and her lady-in-waiting were walking along the promenade near Lake Geneva, heading toward the steamship Geneve. The day was calm. The lake shimmered. The Empress wore a long black gown, her waist laced tightly, her hair pinned beneath a veil. And then a man stepped forward. His name was Luigi Lucchini, an Italian anarchist with no particular grudge against Elizabeth. He had intended to assassinate another royal, but that person never showed. So, seeing Sisi walking alone and unguarded, he took the opportunity. In one smooth motion, he pulled a sharpened needle file, a slim, pointed metal tool used for metalwork, and drove it into her chest. She gasped, stumbled, and then, almost incredibly, she stood up. She righted herself. She continued walking, even boarded the boat. She smiled at the ticket taker. And then she collapsed. No one realized what had happened. The wound was so small, so precise, that it barely bled. Her corset, laced as tight as ever, had stopped the bleeding long enough to fool even her own body. It wasn't until they undid her bodice, perhaps to loosen her breath, that the truth became visible. A small puncture, a trickle of blood, and then the horror. The file had pierced her pericardium, the membrane around the heart. Her lungs had begun to fill, her pulse slowed, and there, aboard a boat she never meant to die on, Elizabeth of Austria faded into history. And here's where it gets even stranger. The assassin's weapon, a humble needle file, was not the grand blade of a revolutionary. It wasn't even a proper dagger. It was, effectively, a sharpened piece of junk metal. Something small enough to hide in a sleeve, cheap enough to be found in any tool chest, and just deadly enough to end an empress. Some scholars still debate whether her corset helped her survive longer, or accelerated her death. The pressure may have slowed her bleeding, or it may have forced the blood into her lungs more quickly. It's still not fully agreed upon. Either way, the irony is cruel. A woman who spent her life bound by the pursuit of physical perfection may have been undone by the very thing she thought protected her. And then there's the strange beauty of it all. The setting, the stillness of the lake, the calmness of the day, the quiet weapon, the silence of her death. No drama, no screaming crowd, just a whispered gasp, a hidden wound, and a queen who walked 15 paces toward the end of her story before anyone even noticed it had begun. In the days that followed, there was a public outpouring of grief and confusion. People could hardly believe that one of the most celebrated figures in Europe, a woman whose hair had inspired poetry, whose waistline was legendary, whose portraits had hung in gilded halls, could vanish with so little fanfare. But that was Cece. She had always been elusive. Even in life, she hid behind veils and vanished into forests. And in death, she disappeared just as quietly. Her assassin was caught immediately, bystanders tackling him before he could run. He was imprisoned. But the Empress? She was gone before the boat even pulled from the dock. It's tempting to romanticize her end, to imagine that in her final moments she finally got what she wanted. Anonymity, no pageantry, no ceremony, just the open sky, the water, and the hush of history closing in. But make no mistake, this was a brutal, humiliating death. Not because of blood or gore, but because of how ordinary it was. She wasn't guarded, she wasn't armoured. She was just a woman, walking by the lake, dressed in black, trying to breathe behind a corset that gave her form but stole her freedom. And it wasn't a war or a revolution that took her down. It was a file, a tool. Something so small you could tuck it in your boot and forget it was there. Let that sit for a moment. A sharpened file, a corset, and the pressure of being perfect. All the power in the world can't protect you from something so small it can slip between your ribs. And in that way, Elizabeth joins the strange pantheon of royals whose deaths remind us that the most embarrassing ends are not always the bloodiest or the most absurd. They're the ones that strip away the myth. Because in the end, she wasn't an empress. She was a woman who tried to run from the crown and instead ran straight into fate. So if you ever feel pressure to be perfect, to be flawless, admired, envied, just remember Cece. The woman who wore the tightest corsets in Europe and never could breathe free. The silence feels different now. Not just quiet, but tight, as if the air has been drawn inward, holding its breath for what's next. You're still trailing your fingers along the cold, rough-hewn stone of palace walls, but there's something twitching at the back of your neck, a tiny itch of paranoia. Because tonight's story isn't about bloodshed or banquets or botched explosions. It's about something small, something with wings, something that might be buzzing near your ear right now. Yes, tonight, a monarch is brought low, not by army or assassin, but, allegedly, by a fly. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But welcome to the tragic and truly weird demise of Pope Adrian IV, also known as Nicholas Breakspere, the only Englishman to ever sit on the papal throne. He died in 1159, and if you believe some of the juiciest medieval whispers, he didn't pass in solemn prayer or quiet meditation. He chokes. On a fly. Let's fly backward a bit. Yes, that pun was free. Pope Adrian IV was no slouch. He was educated, determined, and had risen through the ranks of the church with impressive speed. His papacy was filled with drama, rivalries with the Roman Senate, bitter disputes with the King of Sicily, and a simmering feud with the Holy Roman Emperor himself. So you'd think, with all that tension, the man would have gone out in a blaze of political glory. Nope. According to one of the more persistent legends, Adrian was sitting down to enjoy a glass of wine. Some say water, but wine makes the story spicier, when a fly landed on the rim of his cup. Unaware, or perhaps just distracted, he drank deeply and swallowed the insect whole. And that, apparently, was that. A fly lodged in his throat. He began to choke. His attendants rushed to his aid, but it was too late. The Vicar of Christ, the Holy Father, the Bishop of Rome. Now let's be honest here. Historians are split on this one. Many believe the fly tale was invented posthumously by political enemies who wanted to mock the man's legacy. Think about it. If you're trying to undercut the image of spiritual authority, what better way than to suggest your enemy was killed by a bug in a wine glass? Other scholars suggest he actually died of tonsillitis or quinsy. a kind of abscess that can swell and block the throat, which, fair enough, could feel like choking on a fly. So perhaps the story mutated over time. Maybe someone said, he died gasping, and someone else said, what, did he eat a fly? And someone else just wrote it down like it was gospel. But still, the rumour stuck. And it's not alone. Let's drift over to ancient Persia for a moment, where another monarch allegedly met a similarly humiliating insect fate. The story goes that Artaxerxes II, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, had a fondness for dining outdoors. One particularly humid summer evening, while enjoying a bowl of sweet date pudding, he inhaled a gnat. Some claimed it was an allergic reaction, others swore the insect carried disease. Either way, he collapsed and died within hours. Though this one is even harder to verify than Pope Adrian's fate, it was popularized in several medieval retellings as a cautionary tale about arrogance, gluttony, and not screening your food properly. And then of course we have the particularly colourful case of Pyrrhus of Epirus. Yes, the guy we get the phrase Pyrrhic victory from. While not killed by an insect, his humiliating death is often told alongside tales of bizarre demises. During a street skirmish in Argoth, he was struck in the head, not by a sword, not by a spear, but by a roof tile thrown by an old woman. Yes, a commander of armies, brought down by airborne ceramic, courtesy of a cranky civilian. You almost expect the old woman to yell, "Keep it down out there." So while Pyrrhus didn't die from a fly, he fits nicely into this weird family of rulers undone by the smallest, pettiest acts of fate. But back to Pope Adrian IV. Why does this story endure? Why do people want to believe that a fly could kill a pope? Because it's funny and unsettling, and it pokes at the fragile illusion of control. It tells us that no matter how lofty your titles, no matter how ornate your throne or divine your authority, you're still just a person who could, under the right circumstances, be ended by a rogue fly with bad timing. There's something beautifully democratic about that. Let's not forget the symbolism either. In many cultures, flies are associated with decay, corruption, and filth. In medieval Europe, they were sometimes seen as servants of the devil, tiny messengers of pestilence and moral rot. So to die by one? That was practically poetic justice in the eyes of enemies. In Dante's Inferno, corrupt popes are punished in hell in particularly grotesque ways. Wouldn't it be fitting, some thought, for a flawed pope to be taken out by a creature associated with death and sin? Again, whether Adrian IV deserved that kind of symbolism is another debate entirely. He was a product of his time, ruthless when needed, pious when it served him, and probably trying to do his best in a world where enemies were everywhere and poison was cheaper than diplomacy. But his death, true or not, remains a punchline carved into the stone of history. Of course, he's in good company. Roman Emperor Titus, who ruled in the 1st century AD and helped complete the Colosseum, famously said on his deathbed, "I have made but one mistake." No one knows what the mistake was. Some say it was eating bad fish, others think it was trusting his brother. But some ancient sources playfully suggest a bug bite, as if even the greatest Roman builders weren't safe from nature's tiniest saboteurs. So if you're lying in bed tonight, and you hear that annoying high-pitched buzz, pause, reflect, because somewhere out there, a tiny fly once changed the course of history. It toppled a pope, it embarrassed an empire, and it reminded us all that sometimes fate comes with wings and no manners. Let this be your gentle bedtime lesson. Keep your wine covered, eat indoors when possible, and maybe, just maybe, show a little respect to the next fly you see. Because if it took down a pope, what chance do you have? There's a breeze now, slow and chilly, seeping through a crack in the stained glass windows of the palace. It creeps across your neck like a warning, as if the walls themselves are leaning in to whisper, you might want to hold on to something. Because this next royal death, it involves a curtain, a crown, and one very undignified fall. No poison, no grand betrayal, just bad luck and bad footing, and perhaps, just perhaps, a king trying a bit too hard to look dramatic. Tonight, we unravel the unfortunate tale of King Alexander III of Scotland, a monarch whose reign was long, steady, and ironically, brought to an end not by war or sickness, but by a stubborn horse and one very dark night. Let's set the stage. It's 1286. Scotland is still an independent kingdom, though not entirely stable. There's tension between nobles, and the looming threat of English interference always hangs in the background like a fog. But for the moment, things are good. King Alexander has ruled for over 30 years, guiding the country through relative peace and prosperity. He had suffered great personal losses. His wife and all 3 of his children had died, but he was newly remarried to a young French noblewoman, and on this particular night, he was determined to return to her side. That's how it started. A romantic impulse. It was March 18th. A stormy, windy night. Rain poured in slanted sheets. The roads were treacherous. His advisors begged him to wait until morning, but Alexander, perhaps emboldened by wine or simply eager to return to his queen, insisted on travelling through the night. He donned his riding cloak, fastened his crown's inner band, yes, travelling with the crown on was still a thing for some kings, and mounted his horse. He rode with only a few attendants, setting off along the rocky coastal cliffs near Kinghorn. Somewhere along that path, on a wet, crumbling ground, Alexander became separated from his party. When they found him the next morning, his body lay broken at the foot of a steep embankment. Thrown from his horse, neck snapped, crown still nearby in the mud. Now this death, while tragic, wasn't necessarily embarrassing. Accidents happen. Roads were dangerous. Horses slip. But what makes this one worthy of our midnight collection is not just how it happened, but what it caused. Because King Alexander's death triggered a national crisis. With his heir dead and no immediate successor in place, Scotland descended into political chaos. The power vacuum invited multiple claimants to the throne. Cue the entrance. So yes, that tumble in the dark? It arguably started the chain of events that led to William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and centuries of bloodshed. All because one man couldn't wait until daylight to ride back to his wife. Now, let's zoom in for a moment on the weird detail in some versions of this story. Some chroniclers mention that Alexander's horse may have gotten spooked by fabric, specifically a billowing cloak or curtain caught in the wind as they passed near a village home. Others say a curtain was tied around the saddle to block rain and it tangled around the king's leg. Whether that's true or just medieval embellishment is unclear, but it adds a strange theatrical touch to the fall, as if the final act of his life was literally pulled down by a curtain. And that's the image that stuck. A great king, a dark road, a swirl of fabric, and a sudden, fatal fall. And again, he's not alone. But in 1189 he did something unusual. He joined the Third Crusade. That's right, at the age of nearly 67, an impressive age for someone who spent half his life in chainmail, he strapped on armour and led a massive army toward the Holy Land. And he was doing really well, until he came to a river. Yes, after all the politics, the planning, the diplomacy, and the distance, Frederick Barbarossa's death came not from a sword or an arrow or an assassin's blade, but from a stream in Turkey. The year was 1190. His army had reached the Salef River in modern-day Turkey. It was summer, hot, dry, and brutal. Some accounts say he removed his armour to cool off, and then attempted to cross the river to bathe. Others claim he was fully armoured and trying to lead his horse across. But what happened next remains consistent across the tale. Frederick slipped. He fell into the water, and whether it was the shock of the cold, the weight of his armour, or just bad luck, he drowned. Now, the beard detail comes in later, when chroniclers, never ones to pass up a little flair, added that his long, majestic beard may have soaked up water and dragged him under. Imagine that. A man so legendary, so powerful, so symbolic of European might, defeated by facial hair? Is it true? Probably not entirely. Armour plus cold water plus old age is enough to explain things, but the image stuck, the beard that betrayed him. What makes it even better is what happened after. His army, stunned and leaderless, didn't know what to do with the body. They couldn't take it all the way to Jerusalem in that heat, so they improvised. They boiled him. Yes, you heard that right. They boiled the emperor's body to separate the bones from the flesh, then preserved the bones in barrels to carry the important parts of him forward. The idea was to bury his remains in the Holy Land as a symbol of completion. They got as far as Antioch before the effort collapsed. His army lost morale, supplies dwindled, the symbolic pilgrimage fizzled. His son tried to keep the crusade going but failed miserably. So Frederick's death didn't just end a life, it ended an entire campaign. All because of a river. And, maybe, a beard. Now, if you think that's the only time hair got in the way of royal survival, buckle up. Let's hop to Russia. Tsar Peter III, husband of Catherine the Great, was known for a lot of things, loving Prussia more than his own country, playing with toy soldiers as an adult, and generally being awkward. He was overthrown by his wife in a coup so smooth it practically had a soundtrack. But according to one apocryphal tale, he was nearly suffocated by his own powdered wig while hiding from assassins. Was it true? Probably not. But the wig-wearing aristocracy of the 18th century had real hazards: lice, fire, and suffocation among them. One particularly odd medical report from the time warned that excessive wig padding could cause breathing issues during sleep. So if Frederick drowned in his beard, Peter nearly asphyxiated in his wig. Hair and royalty? Historically not a good mix. Now let's head back to Scandinavia, where beards are practically a national treasure. King Harald Hardrada of Norway, legendary warrior, ruthless tactician, and one-time claimant to the English throne, reportedly had a beard so long he could braid it around his neck. In battle it was both his pride and his curse. During the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, he was struck by an arrow that pierced his throat. Some versions of the story say his beard had gotten tangled in his armour, preventing him from reacting quickly. Now, is that a stretch? Absolutely. But doesn't it make perfect narrative sense? Mighty Viking king, undone not by cowardice, but by a tangle. Which brings us back to Barbarossa. Because after his death, rumours spread that he didn't die, that he merely slept, beard growing longer and longer inside a mountain in Germany, waiting to return when the empire needed him most. It's said that when his beard winds around the stone table 3 times, he will awaken. That's right, the same beard that allegedly killed him also became the thing that symbolised his return. History, always a little weird. And here's the scholarly twist. Many historians believe Barbarossa's death marked a symbolic turning point in the Crusades. With him gone, the alliance between the great Christian kingdoms fractured. Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France started bickering like siblings on a road trip, and the unified front against Saladin dissolved. So in many ways, Frederick's death wasn't just embarrassing, it was disastrous. All because of a slip in a stream. And maybe a beard that got just a little too ambitious. So, tonight's lesson: trim regularly, avoid wading into rivers in full plate armour, and never, under any circumstance, let your facial hair write checks your body can't cash. Because whether it's wigs, curtains, or a braided beard soaked in alpine water, history has proven one thing, again and again. The most ridiculous things will always find a way to ruin your legacy. You're deep in it now. The air is heavier, tinged with something faintly sweet, like the perfume of wilted flowers. You pass through a narrow archway, the walls tapering inward, the torches flickering just a bit lower. Something about this part of the castle feels off balance, like it's spinning ever so slightly, even though the floor doesn't move. And that's fitting, because tonight we're stepping into a story where the world really did spin, so wildly, so uncontrollably, that one noblewoman danced her way out of existence. This is the strange, mysterious case of the dancing plague, and how it may have claimed a royal soul. The year is 1518, and the city is Strasbourg, part of the Holy Roman Empire, present-day France. The sun beats down on cobblestones as markets buzz and cathedral bells clang overhead. All seems normal, till one woman steps into the street and begins to dance. She moves without music, without joy, without stopping. Her name is Frau Trophia, and she cannot explain why she's dancing, only that she must. Her limbs twitch, her body convulses, and when she collapses from exhaustion, she doesn't rest. She rises and dances again. Within days, dozens join her. Then hundreds. At the height of it, around 400 people were reportedly dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed, some broke bones, and yes, some died. From stroke, heart attack, or pure exhaustion. Among them, it's whispered, was Princess Apollonia von Rellingen, a lesser-known noblewoman of the court whose name appears briefly in medical records and aristocratic correspondence of the time. Apollonia wasn't a major historical figure. She didn't rule. She didn't marry into scandal or die in battle. But she did what few others did. She danced to death. What caused the Strasbourg dancing plague? That's the great mystery. Let's explore the theories. 1. Ergot poisoning. Some scholars believe the dancers had ingested ergot, a mould that grows on damp rye and contains chemicals similar to LSD. It can cause hallucinations, spasms, and delusions. This theory makes sense, until you realise that ergot poisoning also causes convulsions, not rhythmic movement. People trip. They don't waltz. 2. Mass psychogenic illness. This is the most widely accepted theory, essentially mass hysteria, a psychological event, often sparked by stress, fear, or trauma. The people of Strasbourg had just endured famine, disease, and harsh governance. The body, overloaded by despair, found release in motion. Once one person began, others followed, subconsciously mirroring the behaviour in a cascade of psychic dominoes. 3. Divine punishment. Medieval people, unsurprisingly, leaned toward this explanation. Many believed the dancers were cursed by St. Vitus, a patron saint associated with epilepsy and nervous disorders. To appease him, the city built shrines, held processions, and even hired musicians to accompany the dancers, believing it would help them dance out the curse. Spoiler. Whatever the cause, the death toll rose. Witnesses described people foaming at the mouth, their feet blistered and bleeding, eyes rolled back, but their bodies still moving, jerking, leaping, spinning in mechanical, unrelenting rhythm. Enter Apollonia. As the story goes, she joined the dance on the 5th day. Some said she was drawn in by curiosity. Others whispered she was already on the edge, grieving a lost child, battling court gossip, or simply longing for a freedom she couldn't articulate. The details blur, as they always do with women lost to time. But one thing is agreed upon. She danced for hours. Then days. Then she collapsed. Some accounts say she died of exhaustion. Others claim her heart gave out during one final twirl, her eyes wide, her dress soaked with sweat and river water. She fell mid-spin, her pearl necklace snapping as her body hit the cobblestones, beads bouncing away like tiny fleeing secrets. Now, was Apollonia truly a princess, or a court-adjacent noble, inflated by later storytellers? Hard to say. But she became a symbol of privilege and fragility, of status undone by something so primal, so human, as movement beyond control. The aristocracy tried to distance themselves from the event. They blamed peasants, weather, the saints, but Apollonia's name kept resurfacing in quiet letters and cryptic church notes. Even the blue blood dances, one priest scribbled in the margin of a sermon draft. And that's what made the whole thing so terrifying. This wasn't just poor villagers twitching in the streets. This was society itself. Ladies, knights, merchants, swept up in a madness no crown could stop. There is even an unconfirmed tale that when word of Apollonia's death reached the Habsburg court, one royal quipped, "At least she went out with rhythm." A cold joke, sure, but you can almost hear the uncomfortable laughter over goblets of wine as courtiers nervously checked their own twitching fingers. The plague fizzled out after a few weeks. The dead were buried quietly. No monument was built, no holiday marked its passing. But the idea lingered, that the body could betray you, that something unseen, whether psychological, spiritual, or fungal, could seize your limbs and march you straight to the grave. And what makes it so chilling is that it wasn't a single royal mistake. No grand act of foolishness or drunken ego. It was submission to a rhythm no one understood, to an impulse that couldn't be stopped. Let's also pause to appreciate that the city's solution at one point was to build a giant stage and hire musicians to play alongside the dancers. Their thinking? If people needed to dance, might as well give them a beat. Imagine that. You're writhing in pain, body refusing to stop, and a lute player just casually sets up next to you like it's open mic night at the Plague. Medieval logic at its finest. In the end, Apollonia's name faded. Her story, like many women of her station, was absorbed into legend. But every so often, it resurfaces in footnotes and whispers. And every time, it raises the same uneasy thought. What if your body decided to leave without you? What if you couldn't say no? That's what makes this royal death so memorable. Not just its embarrassment, but its helplessness. A princess, gliding in silks, unable to stop. A noble life, unravelled not by treason or illness, but by music no one else could hear. So if you ever feel like dancing and don't know why, maybe don't. Or at least keep your heart rate in check. By now the castle walls are groaning under the weight of all the weirdness they've contained. The fire in the hearth has burned down low, casting long shadows that twitch like guilty courtiers trying to avoid eye contact. You're still following the thread of history's most embarrassing royal exits. But this next tale? It's feathered, it's frantic, and it involves a chicken. Tonight, we follow a nobleman, possibly even a king, who ran, slipped, and met his maker while chasing poultry. There are a few competing versions of this tale, scattered across centuries and continents, but one of the most enduring comes from the life of King Bela of Hungary, who reigned in the mid-11th century. Now, Bela was a warrior king. He fought battles, crushed rebellions, and was generally regarded as a capable, no-nonsense ruler. But in a cruel twist of cosmic comedy, he may have been killed not by an enemy blade, but by clumsiness and birds. Let's rewind. According to one of the oldest chronicles of Hungarian history, the Chronicon Pictum, Bela met his end in a curious way. He had ordered construction on a new throne platform, a ceremonial dais, something grand, something majestic. But it wasn't quite finished when he decided to inspect it. Some say he was pacing, others say he was showing off to visiting nobles, and one particularly gleeful account claims there was a chicken, yes, a live chicken, on the dais, pecking away at something it shouldn't. Bela, annoyed or perhaps just feeling oddly fatherly about public presentation, chased the bird, and the platform gave way beneath him. It collapsed. He fell. Hard. And that, allegedly, was that. Died chasing a chicken. Now, is this exactly how it happened? Probably not. But the bones of the story hold up. Bela did indeed die from injuries sustained in a fall while inspecting a ceremonial structure, and someone, somewhere, decided to add a chicken for flavour. And honestly, it fits. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Bela's death left Hungary briefly vulnerable, triggering a dispute over succession and sending ripples through European alliances. Just imagine it. European nobility whispering behind fans and goblets. Did you hear about Hungary? Their king fell off a box. A box. Well, there was a chicken. What elevates this tale from a mere fool to full-fledged farce is the idea that a royal... And Bela wasn't alone. Let's take a side trip to Emperor Valerian of Rome. Not killed by poultry, but arguably one of the most humiliating ends to a ruler in Roman history. He was captured by the Persians in the 3rd century AD, and instead of being ransomed or executed like a proper enemy, he was used as a footstool by the Persian king, Shapur I, a literal human footrest. When Valerian eventually died, still in captivity, his skin was allegedly stuffed and displayed as a war trophy. No chickens involved, sure, but definitely maximum humiliation. Meanwhile, in medieval Scotland, there's a half-true, half-ridiculous tale of a nobleman named Sir Archibald Douglas, who supposedly broke his leg tripping over a goose during a royal feast. The injury got infected, and within weeks he was dead. The goose? Unharmed. Possibly promoted? And then there's King Philip of France, who reportedly fell off his horse during a hunt, not because of a fierce boar or treacherous ravine, but because a swan flapped suddenly near his face. Startled, the horse reared, Philip fell, and the crown clattered into the reeds. Swan, 1. Monarchy, 0. Back to chickens, though. They've been haunting the aristocracy for centuries. Queen Marie Antoinette was known for keeping ornamental chickens in her private farm at Versailles. They wore little ribbons and pecked at gilded feed bowls. And while none of her chickens killed her directly, the fact that she cosplayed as a shepherdess while her people starved certainly didn't help her reputation. Ironically, when she was finally marched to the guillotine, the crowds chanted not about her extravagance or politics, but about her ridiculous farm animals. Which proves that sometimes it's the fluffiest things that sharpen the blade. Let's get speculative for a second. Why does this kind of death haunt the royal imagination so much? Why do we love the idea of kings being taken down by chickens, or slipping on soap, or choking on a grape? Because it's a narrative equalizer. In a world where royalty was cloaked in divine right, velvet and gold leaf, these stories yank the curtain back. They say, you might have ruled empires, but you're still just a clumsy human with questionable balance, and no coordination around livestock. It's also a subtle act of rebellion. Throughout history, when people couldn't openly mock their rulers, they did so in taverns, in whispered stories, and in songs passed from peasant to peasant. These tales of kings falling, sneezing, farting, or chasing chickens were a way to say, they are not untouchable. They trip just like us. Now, back to Bela. His legacy, to be fair, wasn't destroyed by his death. He was remembered for reorganizing Hungary's military and reinforcing royal authority after years of instability. But the weirdness of his final moments clung to him like a feather stuck to a boot. And what about the chicken? It's never named, never seen again. It doesn't get a statue or a mention in the royal scrolls. But you can imagine it, can't you? Strutting off casually, maybe letting out one dismissive balk as it vanishes into the shadows of the court, unaware, or possibly very aware, that it just made history. So if you ever find yourself running late, flustered, and chasing a bird through a parking lot or garden or courtyard, just remember, you're reenacting royal history. And if someone laughs, just tell them you're paying tribute to King Bailey. May he rest in peace. Somewhere in heaven, hopefully not being chased by giant cartoon chickens holding a sign that says "Remember me." It's very late now, or very early. The kind of hour where time folds in on itself and the air feels suspended still, and waiting. You pass another hallway, this one lined with cracked marble busts of long-dead royals, whose names no one says out loud anymore. Their stony expressions seem frozen mid-wince, as if they saw what was coming. And tonight, you're about to meet a monarch who probably deserved exactly what he got. Because this one's less about tragedy and more about cosmic irony, with a flash of lightning, a splash of drama, and a heavy dose of royal karma. Enter King Sebastian I of Portugal, the monarch who vanished in a storm of lies, legends, and just enough arrogance to fry himself under divine voltage. At least, according to one version. Let's begin with the basics. Sebastian became king at just 3 years old. He was young, idealistic, devout, and completely obsessed with the idea of becoming a crusading hero. He dreamed of restoring Christian control over North Africa and earning his place in the pantheon of great kings, not through good governance or treaties, but with a sword and a sunset. By age 24, he'd had enough dreaming. In 1578, he raised an army of 17,000 men, including thousands of untrained peasants and a smattering of foreign mercenaries, and marched into Morocco to wage holy war against the Muslim Saadi dynasty. His advisors begged him not to go. Portugal's economy was strained, the army was disorganized, and he had no heir. But Sebastian was convinced. He believed he was chosen, anointed not just by crown, but by God. So off he went. And what followed was the infamous Battle of Alcacer Quibir, also called the Battle of the Three Kings because, well, 3 different monarchs died there. It was a bloodbath. Sebastian's army was annihilated. The Moroccan forces, vastly superior in numbers and strategy, encircled the Portuguese like wolves closing on sheep. It was a disaster from the start. And then Sebastian disappeared. His body was never found. That's where the mystery and the humiliation begins. Now, logic says he probably died in battle, fell under a heap of bodies, swept away in the chaos, or maybe drowned while fleeing across a river. A soldier later claimed to have seen his horse bolt into a marsh. Another said they saw him bleeding beside a fallen banner. But without a body, the story refused to end. Rumours bloomed like mould on royal tapestry. Some claimed Sebastian had survived and gone into hiding, biding his time to return and reclaim the throne. Others believed he had fled east and become a mystic or hermit. One merchant swore he saw the king disguised as a fisherman on the coast of India. The Portuguese people, grappling with grief and pride, gave this myth a name: Sebastianism. It became a whole movement. For decades, centuries, people claimed Sebastian would return in Portugal's darkest hour, like King Arthur in Britain or Barbarossa in Germany. And here's where things get even more ridiculous. Over the next few decades, at least 4 impostors emerged, claiming to be the lost king. They showed up with flowing hair, tattered robes, and wild stories of escape. One man said he'd been captured and enslaved by pirates. Another insisted he'd faked his death to learn the secrets of the East. Each time, crowds gathered. Hopes flared. And each time, the truth caught up. The most infamous of these pretenders was a commoner from Naples, who made it all the way to court before being exposed. His execution was quiet, but the embarrassment? Deafening. Portugal, once a proud empire, was now chasing ghosts and crowning frauds. But it gets even better. One tale, likely invented by disillusioned Jesuit, claimed that Sebastian hadn't died in battle at all. No, they said he survived, wandered into the mountains and was struck down by lightning during a storm. Why? Because he'd lied. About everything. About his divine mission. About his readiness. About his visions. The story goes that he raised his sword to the heavens, shouting something noble like, "The Lord is my strength," and was immediately zapped out of existence. Just boom. Crisped. Whether or not that actually happened, it's almost too perfect not to believe. The young king, full of pride, charging into war, ignoring every warning, and then struck down by nature itself, like a cosmic eye roll. A few medieval chroniclers even leaned into the poetic detail. One wrote that his boots were found smoking beside a patch of scorched earth. Another added that his royal signet ring was fused to the hilt of his sword, melted by the heavens. And you know what? Let's just accept that version, because sometimes history needs to be a little theatrical. Sebastian's death, or disappearance, or lightning-fried vaporization, plunged Portugal into crisis. With no direct heir, the throne passed to his great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, who was elderly and childless. When Henry died 2 years later, Portugal was left vulnerable. Spanish seized the opportunity. In 1580, King Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese crown, uniting the 2 kingdoms under Spanish rule and triggering 60 years of foreign dominance. All because one young king couldn't resist the urge to play knight. So yes, Sebastian's death was humiliating. Not just because of the possible lightning or the endless fakes, but because he became a symbol of what happens when fantasy overrides reality, when royal ego meets actual consequences. And the irony? The man who wanted to be remembered as a warrior saint became a ghost story, a punchline, a wistful whisper. He'll come back, people said. He's not gone, just hiding. But centuries passed, and no one came back. Eventually, even the most faithful Sebastianists gave up. The myth collapsed. Portugal moved on. And Sebastian? He became a smudge in the footnotes of textbooks, a mystery no one really wanted to solve anymore. But we remember him here, because his death, or disappearance, is a lesson in theatrical failure, in overreaching, in marching into a storm with no umbrella and yelling at the thunder, "You can't touch me, I'm the king." And if lightning does get you, well, you kind of asked for it. The castle feels emptier now, like it's holding the breath of every foolish ruler you've met so far. The long hallways echo your footsteps as you make your way toward the final chamber, a quiet room lit by a single flickering lantern, the kind of place where the stories are softer, more fragile, but no less absurd. And fittingly, our final tale isn't about a king slain in battle, or one zapped by heaven's voltage, or even tripped up by poultry. No, this is about a monarch who faked his own death, and botched it so badly that even the history books had to pause and blink. This is the story of Tsar Alexander I of Russia, or, if you believe the conspiracy, Fyodor Kuzmich, the holiest hermit never crowned. Let's step carefully into this one, because it's not just a story of an awkward death. It's a story of a disappearing act so dramatic, so theatrical, that it turned one of the most powerful men in Europe into an urban legend. Alexander Illustrator reigned during the early 19th century and is best remembered for doing two very big things. Defeating Napoleon, yes, that Napoleon. Mysteriously dying in 1825, only to maybe not be dead. Let's begin at the official version. In late 1825, the Tsar fell ill while on a trip to Taganrog, a quiet city by the Sea of Azov. He had gone there to escape the stress of ruling, the biting St. Petersburg winters, and, according to some, the ghosts of his own conscience. You see, Alexander carried deep guilt over the suspicious death of his father, Tsar Paul II. Years passed. The guilt deepened. So there he was, in Taganrog, suffering from what doctors described as typhus. After a short illness, he was declared dead. Just like that. The nation mourned. The court donned black. A funeral was held. A body was buried. Except the casket remained closed. No one, not even his wife, was permitted to view the body. Strange? Absolutely. And then, a few years later, a man appeared in Siberia. He was tall, quiet, noble-looking. He spoke with unusual eloquence. He had courtly manners and a mysterious aura. He went by the name Fyodor Kuzmich, claimed to be a wandering religious hermit, and lived a modest life of prayer, contemplation, and, not at all, suspicious evasion of personal questions. Fyodor's presence puzzled people. He was literate, educated, fluent in French. He quoted classical texts with ease. His hands were soft, not the hands of a man who worked in fields or workshops. And when asked about his past, he gave vague spiritual answers like, "My sins are mine alone, and I will answer for them before God." Okay, Fyodor. Now this would have been just a curious footnote, until the rumours began. Whispers that he was, in fact, Alexander V, the Tsar who faked his death to escape the crushing guilt of his past and live out his final years in obscurity and penance. It sounds absurd, right? Like the kind of bedtime myth you tell your kids when they ask what happens to emperors after they've had enough war. But it picked up traction. Eyewitnesses swore Fyodor matched Alexander's appearance. An aging general who had served under Alexander visited the hermit and reportedly wept, later confessing, "I have seen my sovereign alive." Even members of the Romanov family, Russia's own royalty, whispered privately that they believed the story. And when Fyodor died in 1864, nearly 40 years after Alexander's death, the Tsar of Russia ordered a state funeral. For a random Siberian hermit? Very suspicious. And then, because no tale of royal embarrassment is complete without a literal twist, the Orthodox Church later canonized Fyodor as a saint. Imagine that. A Tsar who may have abandoned his throne, became a wandering holy man, and ended up more revered in death than he ever was in life? Now, what's so embarrassing about all this? Well, let's suppose it's true. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of faking your own death as a world leader. You'd have to. Find a convincing body double. Bribe the doctor, the mortician, and the guards. Write fake funeral speeches. And then go live somewhere with zero plumbing and give up pastries for the rest of your life. All because you couldn't handle the guilt of a coup you maybe didn't even plan yourself. And then, despite your best efforts, everyone figures it out anyway. That's like sneaking out of your own surprise party, only for someone to find you crying in a bush 10 minutes later while eating the cake you said you didn't want. And if it isn't true, then it's even better. Because that means someone lived such a weirdly regal, convincingly mystical life that the entire Russian Empire decided, yep, that's our missing Tsar. Which is, let's face it, kind of embarrassing for the actual dead Tsar. Fyodor Kuzmich, whether he was Alexander or not, became a legend. Paintings were made of him, books were written, the Russian church gave him a saint's halo. And the man buried in Alexander's tomb, his body was never confirmed. There were whispers, years later, that it had been quietly removed, or that it had never been there at all. Modern scholars still argue over the evidence, handwriting analysis, facial comparisons, political motives. But the fact remains, Alexander's death, whether real or faked, turned into one of the greatest royal identity crises in history, and not a very convincing one. If you're going to vanish into legend, maybe don't show up in the exact same country, speaking like an educated aristocrat, wearing suspiciously royal robes, and holding a ring engraved with your family's crest. It's like claiming to be someone else while wearing a name tag that says, "Hi, I'm Alex." And that, dear listener, is how we end our collection. Not with a bang, not with a sword, but with a whispered identity swap and 40 years of awkward denial. Because sometimes, the most embarrassing royal deaths aren't deaths at all. They're exits, fumbled, suspicious, and wrapped in mystery that only grows more ridiculous with time. So, if you're ever tempted to fake your own demise, remember, it only works if you actually disappear. No fancy accents, no public sainthood, and definitely no monogrammed robes. Because otherwise, you might just be the emperor who died, and then got a second job as himself, pretending not to be.